Massive shout out to the sponsor of today's video, War Thunder. More on them later. Capture of Fort Capuzzo, Allied victory, 14th of June 1940. 4 days after Italy declared war, the British struck first. On June 14th, 1940, armoured units from the British 7th Hussars and 1st Royal Tank Regiment, backed by the RAF's No. 33 Squadron and No. 211 Squadron, crossed from Egypt into Italian Libya and stormed Fort Capuzzo, a small Italian frontier post near the Wire, just west of Sollum. Their objective: disrupt Italian defences before Mussolini's forces could properly mobilise. Italian troops at the fort, who were mostly colonial infantry under the 10th Army's Frontier Guard units, were caught flat-footed. Some were reportedly still awaiting formal war orders when British light tanks rolled in. RAF Gladiators strafed the fort's defences while Blenheims bombed supply dumps. On the ground, British armoured cars and light tanks overran the Italian position with minimal resistance. Casualties on the British side were negligible in this opening skirmish. Simultaneously, armoured cars from the 11th Hussars pushed farther west and seized Fort Maddalena, another isolated post along the frontier. Both raids were designed as quick strikes, smash-and-grab operations, as one British officer put it. Lacking the infantry to hold Capuzzo, British forces blew up ammunition stores and sabotaged equipment each night before withdrawing back to the border. The Italians quickly reoccupied the wrecked fort, but the message was clear. Their Libyan frontier was wide open. More importantly, this marked the first British offensive action in North Africa, a bold psychological blow that undercut Italian morale and sparked a months-long series of border raids. British forces would dominate this early phase of the Desert War. These small, aggressive actions gave them the initiative and kept Italian commanders off balance ahead of their own planned invasion of Egypt. Battle of Ghirba, Allied victory, 16th of June 1940. Just 2 days after the raid on Fort Capuzzo, British forces struck again, this time at Ghirba, a desert outpost roughly 30 miles west of Fort Capuzzo near the Libyan frontier. On June 16, 1940, a mixed British column composed of the 7th and 11th Hussars and supporting artillery moved to intercept an Italian counterattack force near Ghirba. The Italians, still reeling from the loss of Fort Capuzzo, had dispatched a reaction force made up of Libyan colonial troops, armoured cars, and light tanks. The British caught them in open desert. In classic early Desert War fashion, the fight unfolded in a series of mobile engagements. British light tanks and armoured cars manoeuvred around the Italian formation, hitting from multiple directions. British artillery quickly zeroed in. The Italians, mostly in thin-skinned vehicles and lacking air cover, couldn't withstand the pressure. Their formation broke under coordinated ground and artillery fire. At least 3 Italian tanks were knocked out, several vehicles destroyed or abandoned, and an estimated 50 prisoners were taken by the British. British losses were minimal. In fact, British sources describe the engagement as a textbook ambush, a desert skirmish fought on British terms in terrain they knew better, with better coordination. It marked the second British offensive action in just 3 days. Italian forces were now on the defensive across the entire border zone, constantly reacting, never initiating. For the British Western Desert Force, it showed that aggressive, small unit tactics could bleed and rattle a numerically superior opponent. Attack on Mers-el-Kebir, Allied victory, 3rd of July 1940. When France fell to Germany in June 1940, the British government faced a terrifying question. What happens to the French fleet? At this time, the Marine Nationale was one of the largest navies in the world, with more than 200 warships, including modern battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. If that fleet were to fall into Axis hands, it could tip the balance in the Mediterranean, maybe even threaten the British Isles themselves. The French, now under the newly formed Vichy regime, had signed an armistice with Germany and promised to keep their fleet neutral. But Churchill wasn't willing to bet the Royal Navy on a handshake. So on July 3rd, 1940, Britain launched Operation Catapult, a controversial preemptive strike to neutralize the French fleet by force if necessary. The most explosive part of the plan would unfold at Mers-el-Kebir, a heavily fortified French naval base near Oran, Algeria, where a major detachment of French capital ships was anchored. The job fell to Admiral James Somerville, commander of Force H, sailing from Gibraltar. His fleet included the battlecruiser HMS Hood, the battleships HMS Valiant and Resolution, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, and a flotilla of destroyers. His orders: issue an ultimatum, and if the French refused, open fire. Waiting in the harbour were the French battleships Dunkerque, Strasbourg, Breton, Provence, and several destroyers, under the command of Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul. Communications were tense from the start. Gensoul refused to speak directly with Somerville, delegating tasks to a lower officer. The British gave 4 options: join the British and keep fighting, sail to a neutral port like Martinique for internment, disarm the ships under British supervision, or scuttle them immediately. Failing that, they would be sunk. Gensoul stalled, hoping for negotiations, but in London, Churchill had already made up his mind. He feared the French were playing for time. At 5:55 p.m, after hours of silence, Somerville gave the order. The British battleships opened fire from outside the harbour. In under 15 minutes, it was over. Breton was hit in her magazine and exploded, sinking over 1,000 sailors aboard. Provence and Dunkirk were heavily damaged, and only Strasbourg and a few destroyers escaped, dodging salvos and weaving through a narrow exit channel under fire. When the smoke cleared, the results were catastrophic. 1,297 French sailors were dead, killed by their former allies. Britain called it a military necessity, while France called it a betrayal. The diplomatic fallout was immediate. Vichy France cut off relations with Britain. German propaganda pounced, painting Churchill as a warmonger who'd murdered allies in cold blood. Even some British commanders, including Somerville himself, questioned the morality of the strike. But Churchill didn't flinch. To him, the logic was clear: better destroy part of the French fleet than risk the entire thing joining the Axis. And strategically, the gamble worked. The French ships never joined Hitler, and at Alexandria, French commanders allowed British forces to demobilize their vessels peacefully. The rest of the fleet in Toulon was later scuttled in 1942 when Germany invaded Vichy France. Still, Mers-el-Kebir left a scar. Many of those French sailors had fought the Germans weeks earlier. Some had even evacuated Allied troops from Dunkirk. Now they were dead in their own harbour, sunk by ships flying the white ensign. The guns at Mers-el-Kebir fell silent in minutes, but the bitterness lingered for years. This video would not be possible without today's incredible sponsor, War Thunder. One of my absolute favorite PC games, War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat simulator ever made. Take command of various tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from different eras from the 1920s to today. Immerse yourself in intense combat where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. Over 2,500 vehicles from 10 different nations are at your disposal as you take part in epic PvP battles. War Thunder is unmatched in the abundance of content to discover. There's simply no game more suited for fans of military history. No special gear needed, just a mouse and keyboard or whatever's handy, and you're set to pilot a jet or command a tank. War Thunder is free on PC and consoles, and its in-house Daegor engine keeps everything running silky smooth, serving up impressive visuals and high frame rates even on lower end machines. As someone who's always on the move, War Thunder's brand new mobile version has become my go-to time killer. Now on iOS and Android, it packs the franchise's signature realism into intuitive touch controls and eye-popping visuals so I can jump straight in wherever I happen to be. The trademark War Thunder realism is just a whole other level. Every vehicle is modeled down to its individual components, each one vulnerable to damage just like in real-life combat. Whether it's a direct hit to the engine, the ammo storage, or even the crew, every shot has a unique and dramatic impact, just as you'd expect on a real battlefield. For PC and console players, sign up using the links in the description or pinned comment to receive a massive bonus pack with multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, and 7 days of premium access. Available for a limited time only to new players and those who haven't played in over 6 months. So what are you waiting for? Download War Thunder on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and now mobile, and join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today. The Italian invasion of Egypt, Axis victory, 13th of September 1940 to 16th of September 1940. Mussolini had promised to crush British imperial power in Africa, to sweep across Egypt and seize the Suez Canal, a gateway to India, oil, and empire. Around 90,000 Italian troops waited in Libya, sweltering in the heat, baking under orders that hadn't come. But his generals weren't ready, his tanks were outdated, and his logistics were a joke. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commander of Italy's 10th Army, didn't believe in the plan. He had no illusions about what his undertrained, poorly equipped army could do against British armor, aircraft, and desert experience. But when Mussolini demanded a show of force, Graziani gave him one. On the 13th of September 1940, the Italians finally rolled east. Italy's 10th Army launched its long-awaited push across the Libyan border. The objective was to occupy Sidi Barrani, threaten Mersa Matruh, and show the world that Italy could carve up the British Empire just like Hitler was doing in Europe. The operation, codenamed Operazione E, was less a full-scale invasion than a heavily advertised show of force. But once it started, there was no turning back. The Italian force was formidable. 5 divisions, nearly 90,000 men, including colonial troops and black shirts, supported by hundreds of tanks and a decent artillery train. Backing them from the air was the Regia Aeronautica. Opposing them was Major General Richard O'Connor's Western Desert Force, just 30,000 to 36,000 British and Commonwealth troops, mainly the 4th Indian Division and 7th Armoured Division support group. Outnumbered nearly 3 to 1, the British knew they couldn't stop the Italians head-on, so they didn't try. As the Italians reoccupied Fort Capuzzo and crossed into Egypt, British forces executed a textbook fighting withdrawal, destroying wells, laying mines, booby-trapping abandoned positions, and ambushing Italian flanks with fast-moving patrols. RAF Gladiators and Blenheims harassed columns when targets presented themselves. This had the desired effect of slowing the Italian advance. Italian progress wasn't helped by Graziani zigzagging his divisions along the coast, which meant slow movements in the desert. British intelligence tracked every move. Massive dust clouds from Italian truck convoys gave away their location long before contact. On some days, the advance was just 8 to 10 kilometers. British officers joked the Italians were advancing to brew tea, not to wage war. But the British were still falling back. By the 16th of September, the Italians had penetrated roughly 95 kilometers into Egypt and occupied Sidi Barrani, a small coastal town. Graziani halted the advance exactly there. His supply lines were already overstretched. Desert navigation was proving chaotic as one Italian mechanized group literally got lost and had to be spotted by aircraft. Graziani didn't want to move on Mersa Matruh just 130 kilometers further east until a new supply road, the Via della Vittoria, was built behind him. So instead of pushing forward, the Italians dug in. Around Sidi Barrani, they began constructing a series of fortified camps, each garrisoned by a regiment or more, wired and mined, but isolated from one another with no internal defense line. It was a slow-motion occupation that looked more like a camping trip than a military offensive. One Italian colonel reportedly called it, quote, a walk in the desert. Rome wanted good news, and unfortunately, Graziani was overly cautious. He had advanced as much as he could with the resources he had, but that only meant the capture of a small town in the middle of the desert. Mussolini, desperate for headlines, declared it a victory anyway. But the reality? The Italians had seized a sliver of desert and failed to engage the core of the British force, which remained intact. British casualties were under 50 killed, while Italian forces suffered roughly 120 dead and scattered losses from breakdowns, heat strokes, and disorientation. In Cairo, defenses were bolstered. Churchill, watching from London, was alarmed but intrigued. The Italian army, he noted, was now deep in Egyptian territory, spread out and vulnerable. That vulnerability would come back to haunt them. Battle of Sidi Barrani, Allied victory, 9th of December 1940 to the 11th of December 1940. After 3 months of retreat, the British finally struck back. On the 9th of December 1940, under the cover of darkness and total radio silence, Major General Richard O'Connor's Western Desert Force launched Operation Compass, a surprise attack on the Italian 10th Army. Originally intended as a 5-day raid, the operation quickly grew into a full-scale offensive that would dismantle Italy's entire Egyptian position. The Italians were spread thin across a dozen fortified camps between Maktila and Sidi Barrani, with a little mutual support and no mobile reserve. Each camp was a box-shaped fortress, and on paper, they looked formidable, but in reality, they were islands, isolated outposts with no mutual support, scattered across the desert and vulnerable to defeat. British intelligence mapped out these positions using aerial reconnaissance and desert patrols. O'Connor chose to strike at the southernmost camp first, Nibaiwa, held by the Italian Libyan Division and the Maletti Group, a mechanized force of tanks and artillery. At dawn, Matilda II infantry tanks, heavily armored and impervious to most Italian weapons, smashed through the defenses backed by Indian infantry from the 4th Indian Division. The Italians were caught flat-footed. General Pietro Maletti was killed trying to organize resistance. Nibaiwa fell within hours. From there, British forces turned north toward Tumal west and east. These camps fought back harder, but the pattern was the same. British armor punched holes, artillery and RAF bombers suppressed resistance, and mobile infantry cleared the rest. The Italians, built for defense, had no answer for the maneuver warfare coming at them. By the 10th of December, the 7th Armored Division had completed a wide flanking movement to cut off Sidi Barrani from the west. British and Indian infantry attacked the town from multiple sides. The 4th CCNN Blackshirt Division and the 63rd Cyrenaica Division tried to hold the line, but by midday on the 11th of December, Sidi Barrani was in British hands. The encirclement was complete. Over 20,000 Italian soldiers surrendered. The Italians lost nearly a quarter of their Egyptian expeditionary force in 3 days. British casualties were minimal by comparison, just over 600 total killed, wounded or missing. The fall of Sidi Barrani shattered Italy's forward line in Egypt. Graziani's remaining forces began a hasty retreat toward Bardia and Tobruk, trying to regroup behind the Libyan frontier. In London, Churchill was elated. For a British public hammered by the Blitz, Compass was the first major land victory of the war. A brilliant and hazardous operation, he called it. It was that, and more. It was the moment the balance of power in North Africa began to tilt. The Battle of Bardia, Allied victory, 3rd of January 1941 to the 5th of January 1941. With Sidi Barrani in British hands and the Italian line collapsing, O'Connor kept moving. His next target was Bardia, a heavily fortified coastal town just across the Egyptian-Libyan border. Held by more than 40,000 troops, Bardia was Italy's largest base in eastern Libya. The defenders were under General Annibale Bergonzoli, a flamboyant figure known as Electric Whiskers. The assault began at dawn on the 3rd of January 1941. British and Aussie forces moved in from the south and west. The 6th Australian Division, under Major General Ivan Mackey, led the infantry attack, its first major operation of the war. Backing them were 23 Matilda II tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, along with artillery and RAF support. The Italians had spent months fortifying Bardia. The perimeter bristled with minefields, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire and bunkers. But the British knew exactly where to hit. Australian engineers breached the wire and mines in the early morning, and the Matildas punched through the Italian front line by midday. Inside the perimeter, Italian units fought hard, but the Australians moved fast, clearing one strong point after another. By nightfall, British armour had broken through to the 2nd defensive belt. Italian command structure began to break down. On the 4th of January, the Australians drove toward the town itself. Resistance crumbled. Italian artillery and garrison troops surrendered en masse. By the morning of the 5th of January, Bardia had fallen. The Allies captured more than 36,000 prisoners, along with 400 guns and 130 tanks. It was, at the time, the largest single Axis surrender of the war. British and Australian losses were light, just under 500 casualties total. The victory at Bardia shattered Italy's hold on the Libyan-Egyptian border. O'Connor now had a direct path to Tobruk, and the Italians had no more prepared defences east of Cyrenaica. The desert war was turning, and fast. The capture of Tobruk, Allied victory, 21st of January 1941 to 22nd of January 1941. After Bardia, the road to Tobruk lay wide open. Italian forces were retreating west in chaos, abandoning equipment and digging in at the next major defensive line, Tobruk. A crucial deep-water port and supply hub, it was one of the best natural harbours in North Africa, strategically vital for controlling eastern Libya. If the British couldn't take it, they'd take away the Italians' logistics lifeline. On the 21st of January 1941, the assault began. The 6th Australian Division, fresh from its first victory at Bardia, again led the attack. The division was reinforced by British tanks from the 7th Armoured Division and supported by RAF bombers and fighters flying constant sorties over the port and perimeter. Tobruk's defences were formidable. The Italians had built a double-ringed perimeter stretching over 30 kilometres, lined with bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields and barbed wire. The town itself sat behind these outer defences, protected by the 61st Infantry Division Serte, units of the Libyan Colonial Army, and coastal artillery batteries. But the defenders were battered. Many had retreated in disarray from Sidi Barrani and Bardia. Morale was low and communications were fractured. Italian General Enrico Pitazzi Manella, commanding Tobruk, had about 25,000 men, but many were poorly supplied and demoralized. At dawn on the 21st, the Australians broke through the southern perimeter. Engineers cleared lanes through the minefields, and Matilda II tanks smashed straight through the Italian front line, as they had at Nebaiwa and Bardia. Infantry followed close behind, clearing bunkers one by one with grenades and small arms fire. By nightfall, the first defensive belt had collapsed. On the 22nd of January, the Australians renewed the assault, pressing into the town itself. Resistance stiffened. Italian coastal batteries fired until they were overrun, and some units fought stubbornly from strongpoints. But it just wasn't enough. By midday, Tobruk had fallen. Italian defences collapsed from within, and white flags went up across the harbour. More than 20,000 Italian troops surrendered. The Allies captured numerous artillery pieces and tanks, and hundreds of trucks and supply vehicles. British and Australian casualties were low, just over 400 in total. Tobruk's capture was a devastating blow to Italian North Africa. Graziani's ability to hold Cyrenaica was now in doubt. His eastern command structure was shattered, and British forces had seized a critical port that would soon be turned into a major Allied logistical hub. In 2 months, O'Connor's force had destroyed nearly half of the Italian 10th Army. The Italians had been thoroughly routed, their aura of numerical strength broken. With Tobruk in hand, the Western Desert Force now had the supplies, momentum and open desert ahead to keep pushing west. Graziani, now holed up in Benghazi, had little left to throw into the fight. The Italians had underestimated the British once, now they were paying for it town by town. The Battle of Kufra, Allied victory, 31st of January 1941 to the 1st of March 1941. In the middle of nowhere, Free France found its first battlefield. Over 800 kilometers south of the Mediterranean coast, deep in the Libyan Sahara, the Italians held Kufra Oasis, an isolated outpost centered on El Tag Fort. It was dusty, remote, and, to Rome, seemingly untouchable. Enter Colonel Philippe Leclerc and the men of Free France. On the 31st of January 1941, Leclerc set out from French Chad with a force of around 400 men, mostly African colonial troops and French officers, to challenge Italian control. They were accompanied by a British patrol from the Long Range Desert Group, desert warfare specialists who guided Leclerc's column across hundreds of kilometers of barren sand and rock. Their objective was to seize Kufra, secure the southern flank of Allied North Africa, and put Free France on the map. The march alone was an ordeal. Crossing trackless desert in light trucks and a few armored cars, Leclerc's column relied on the LRDG navigators and pure determination. When asked how they'd find their way back without landmarks, LRDG Major Pat Clayton reportedly said, "Mon Colonel, in the desert, we make our own roads." The Italians never saw them coming. On the 7th of February, Leclerc captured the smaller oasis of Bouma, using it as a forward base. The main Italian garrison withdrew to Kufra's stronghold, El Tag, an old Ottoman-era fort reinforced with trenches, barbed wire, and light artillery. It was defended by around 400 troops, a mix of Italian officers and Libyan colonial soldiers. They had machine guns, a few 20mm cannons, some armored cars and supplies, but they were cut off. The siege began in mid-February. The Free French shelled the fort with mortars and a 75mm gun, while the LRDG launched a classic raid, ambushing an Italian relief convoy in the desert and destroying their only hope for reinforcement. That sealed Kufra's fate. The fighting was slow and grinding. Leclerc's men, vastly outnumbered on paper in terms of firepower, tightened the noose one position at a time. Skirmishes broke out across the dunes. Ammunition ran low on both sides. Still, the Italians held until the final night. On March 1st, 1941, El Tag fort fell. The Free French flag was raised over Kufra, the first piece of French territory liberated in the war. Casualties were modest. The Free French lost around 17 killed and 37 wounded, while Italian losses included 50 to 60 dead, about 100 wounded, and nearly 300 prisoners. Several armored cars and trucks were also captured, along with weapons and ammunition. Leclerc assembled his men beneath the palm trees and had them swear an oath. They would not stop fighting until the French flag flew over Strasbourg Cathedral. That oath, taken in the sand-blown ruins of Kufra, would echo all the way to the liberation of France. Kufra denied the Italians a potential launch pad towards Sudan or Chad and gave the Allies a permanent base in the deep desert. It also marked the beginning of Leclerc's legendary campaign. He would march from Kufra to join the main Allied forces in Tunisia in 1943, covering over 2,000 miles of desert and battlefield. Kufra was a small battle by the numbers, but for Free France, it was everything. The Battle of Beda Fomm, Allied victory, 6th of February 1941 to the 7th of February 1941. By early February 1941, the Italian 10th Army was in full retreat across Cyrenaica, trying to escape west along the coastal Via Balbia road. After losses at Sidi Barrani, Bardia and Tobruk, Marshal Graziani ordered his remaining forces, more than 100,000 men, to fall back toward Tripolitania and regroup. But the British weren't about to let him go. Major General Richard O'Connor saw an opportunity: cut the Italians off before they could escape. His plan hinged on speed. He ordered elements of the 7th Armored Division and a small mobile blocking force known as Combe Force, named after its commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Combe, to swing south through the desert and race ahead of the Italian column. Their destination was a dusty crossroads near a fishing village called Beda Fomm, southwest of Benghazi. If they could get there first, they could stop the entire Italian army cold. They got there on the 5th of February, just barely. Compromising a few armored car squadrons, some 2-pounder anti-tank guns, and motorized infantry, Combe Force dug in across the road. On the 6th of February, the first elements of the Italian 10th Army slammed into them and were stunned to find the route west blocked. What followed was a desperate 2-day battle in the open desert. The Italians attacked in waves, columns of trucks, tanks, and artillery trying to blast their way through. British anti-tank gunners knocked out dozens of Italian vehicles at close range, often firing over open sights. Matilda tanks from the 7th Royal Tank Regiment reinforced the line and held firm. Despite being outnumbered and lightly equipped, Combe Force refused to budge. Behind them, more British forces were closing in from the east. The retreating Italians were now caught in a vice. On the 7th of February, the trap snapped shut. British forces struck the Italian rearguard while Combe Force held the front. The road was littered with burning trucks and wrecked tanks. Chaos erupted, units broke, and Italian officers surrendered en masse. By nightfall, the battle was over. The British had captured over 25,000 Italian troops, including the commander of the 10th Army, General Giuseppe Tallera, who died of wounds shortly after capture. The remains of Graziani's army, once 150,000 strong, had been destroyed. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats in modern Italian military history. British losses were light, less than 500 casualties across the final phase of Compass. In just 2 months, O'Connor had advanced over 800 kilometers, captured more than 130,000 prisoners, and taken over 400 tanks and 1,200 guns. His forces had done the impossible on a shoestring, with no air superiority and minimal logistical support. Churchill was amazed, but he was also impatient. He soon ordered the redeployment of British forces to Greece, fearing a German intervention in the Balkans. O'Connor's campaign halted just short of Tripoli. Still, the Battle of Beda Fomm marked the end of Italy's offensive hopes in North Africa. Within weeks, Graziani resigned in disgrace. The Axis would have to send reinforcements, and fast. That reinforcement would come in the form of a little-known German general named Erwin Rommel. But for now, the desert belonged to the British. Axis counteroffensive in Cyrenaica. Axis victory, 24th of March 1941 to the 15th of April 1941. The Italians had been crushed, but the Germans had just arrived. In February 1941, as the British wrapped up Operation Compass, a new force landed in Libya, the Afrika Korps, commanded by Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel. Sent by Hitler to prop up the collapsing Italian front, Rommel arrived with a small advance guard, just 2 divisions, 1 armoured and 1 light infantry, but he had a mandate to act fast. London had already diverted much of its western desert force to Greece, fearing an Axis invasion of the Balkans. O'Connor's battle-hardened troops were thinned out, tired, and stretched across hundreds of kilometers of desert. Cyrenaica was wide open, and Rommel knew it. On the 24th of March 1941, he struck. The offensive began with reconnaissance in force, but quickly escalated. German armoured columns, supported by Italian units regrouping after their earlier defeats, launched a series of fast-moving attacks that stunned the British garrisons in eastern Libya. British screening forces at El Agheila and Mersa were overwhelmed and pushed back in confusion. Rommel's tactics were classic blitzkrieg, fast armour coordinated with mobile infantry and dive bombers. His 5th Light Division, soon joined by the 15th Panzer Division, drove deep into Cyrenaica, bypassing strong points and creating panic in the British rear. By early April, Benghazi fell and the British were in full retreat. The defense of Cyrenaica collapsed almost as quickly as it had been taken. British commanders, caught off guard by the speed and aggression of the German attack, scrambled to stabilize the front. But Rommel didn't pause. He pushed east, chasing retreating British and Commonwealth units along the Via Balbia. Supply lines were tenuous, but Rommel's gamble paid off. On the 7th of April, German and Italian forces reached the outskirts of Tobruk. British and Australian defenders dug in, and the port city held, for now, but everything east had been lost. One of the most shocking moments came when Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor himself, hero of Operation Compass, was captured. He'd been inspecting the front near Derna when his staff car blundered into a German patrol. Just weeks after dismantling the Italian 10th Army, he was now a prisoner of war. By mid-April, Rommel had advanced more than 500 kilometers in 3 weeks, retaking almost all of Cyrenaica. Only Tobruk remained as a stubborn Allied stronghold. What had seemed like total Allied dominance in North Africa was suddenly in question. Rommel's advance stunned the British High Command and forced a complete reassessment of the Desert War. The front had swung like a pendulum, and the new German commander had proven himself a master of maneuver in open terrain. The Axis had the initiative, and the myth of Rommel, the Desert Fox, had just begun to take shape. The Siege of Tobruk, Allied victory, 10th of April 1941 to the 27th of November 1941. Tobruk was never supposed to hold out, but it did for 241 days. When Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps blitzed across Cyrenaica in March 1941, British forces reeled. They lost Benghazi, Derna, and Mekili in quick succession. Most of the Western Desert Force fell back toward the Egyptian border, but one vital port was still in Allied hands: Tobruk. A deep water harbour on Libya's eastern coast, Tobruk was a logistical prize. It could support thousands of troops, store supplies, and act as a forward base. Rommel couldn't leave it in Allied hands, and the British couldn't afford to lose it. So Tobruk, ringed by old Italian-built defences, became the flashpoint for the next phase of the Desert War. The city's defenders were a patchwork force under Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead of Australia. Most were from the 9th Australian Division, supported by British artillery, Indian engineers, and elements of Polish and Czechoslovak units. In total, roughly 35,000 troops. Many were barely trained in desert warfare. Most had never faced German armour. They would become legends. Rommel reached the city by the 7th of April 1941. His goal was to take it quickly before the Allies could dig in or reinforce. On the 10th of April, the siege formally began. German and Italian units began probing the outer defences. On the 13th of April, Rommel launched his first major assault on the southern perimeter. Italian Bersaglieri infantry and German Panzergrenadiers attacked entrenched Australian positions near Ras el Mador. They were repulsed. The defences around Tobruk were formidable. Anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and old Italian gun pits ringed the city. Morshead, known to his troops as Ming the Merciless, ordered aggressive patrols and no withdrawal under any circumstance. His men fought hard. They dubbed themselves the Rats of Tobruk, a name initially coined as an insult by German propaganda, but quickly turned into a badge of honour. Rommel shifted tactics. Instead of direct assaults, he settled into a siege, cutting off Tobruk by land, shelling it by day, and bombing it by night. He believed the defenders would eventually collapse from attrition, but the Royal Navy had other plans. Despite Axis control of the surrounding desert, the British maintained naval access via the sea. Fast destroyers, minesweepers, and supply ships, known as the Tobruk Ferry Service, braved air attacks and naval mines to bring in food, ammunition, and reinforcements. These nightly runs kept the garrison alive. German Stukas tried to choke the harbour with daily raids. The Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps 10, operating from Crete and Benghazi, launched hundreds of sorties, but the Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy persisted. At one point, supplies arrived by submarine, slipping in under the cover of darkness. Tobruk's gunners proved their worth. German tanks were destroyed by well-placed 2-pounder and 6-pounder guns, many firing over open sights. Mines and anti-tank ditches forced the Afrika Korps to fight on foot, giving the defenders the edge. By May 1941, Rommel launched another major assault, again focusing on the southern sector. German tanks punched holes in the lines near Derna Road, and several strongpoints were overrun. But counterattacks pushed them back. The defenders showed no signs of breaking. Meanwhile, the British began preparing a relief operation. Operation Brevity in May, followed by Operation Battleaxe in June. Both failed to break through, but Tobruk still held. Inside the perimeter, conditions worsened. Heat, flies, lack of water, and constant shelling wore down morale, but the Australians and their allies refused to quit. Their patrols regularly raided Axis lines at night, capturing prisoners, destroying supply dumps, and keeping Rommel's forces off balance. Rommel, too, was under pressure. His supply lines were overstretched, his tanks worn down, and his Italian allies exhausted. In July and August, he was forced to pause offensive operations. In October 1941, a new British commander took charge, General Claude Auchinleck. He began planning a massive new offensive, Operation Crusader, designed to push Rommel out of Cyrenaica entirely. The fighting was brutal and confused. At Sidi Bou Zid, British and Commonwealth forces suffered heavy losses, but Rommel, overstretched and facing attacks from multiple directions, began pulling back. On the 27th of November, British armoured units were able to link up with the Tobruk garrison. The siege was over. Tobruk had held for 8 months under siege, the longest defended siege in British military history since the Crimean War. The defenders had endured constant bombardment, supply shortages, and repeated assaults, but never broke. Their stand tied down a significant portion of the Afrika Korps, blunted German momentum, and gave the British a foothold inside Libya even during their darkest days. Rommel's plan for a swift knockout had failed. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Axis forces suffered thousands of casualties, particularly during assaults in April and May. Allied losses were also substantial, though exact numbers are hard to separate from broader campaign figures. What's clear is that Tobruk's resistance shaped the entire trajectory of the Desert War. And the rats of Tobruk, they etched themselves into the front page of history. Operation Brevity, inconclusive, 15th of May 1941 to the 16th of May 1941. By May 1941, Tobruk was still holding, but barely. Rommel's Afrika Korps maintained its siege, and British command was under growing pressure to act. With most of Cyrenaica back in Axis hands, the front line had settled near the Egyptian border. British commanders saw an opening. The Axis positions east of Tobruk were thin. The result was Operation Brevity, a short, limited offensive meant to test German defences, seize key terrain along the coastal road, and, if possible, relieve pressure on Tobruk. It was never intended as a full-scale breakthrough. The British hoped a sharp, fast attack would catch Rommel off guard and possibly roll back his forward line near the border. The assault began on the 15th of May. British forces, under Brigadier William Gott, just over 2,000 men with around 50 tanks, advanced across the frontier. The first blow fell on Halfa Pass, a steep escarpment critical for controlling movement along the coast. The position was taken quickly, and British units moved west toward Fort Capuzzo, which also fell after a brief armoured engagement. But the success didn't last. German forces, including elements of the 5th Light Division, quickly regrouped and launched counterattacks. British cruisers, lightly armoured and outgunned, suffered under German 50mm and 88mm anti-tank fire. At point 206 and around Fort Capuzzo, British armour faltered. The Matilda IIs held up better, but they lacked the speed and flexibility for exploitation. Within 24 hours, the momentum had shifted. By the morning of the 16th of May, the British were pulling back, abandoning most of their early gains except for Halfa Pass. The operation ended as quickly as it had begun. Tobruk remained under siege and Rommel's front line was bruised but not broken. A larger, riskier assault would follow within a month. Its name was Operation Battleaxe. Operation Skorpion, Axis Victory, 26th of May 1941 to the 27th of May 1941. Operation Brevity had barely ended when Rommel hit back. British forces had managed to seize Halfa Pass during the brief offensive earlier in May, but their hold on the position was precarious. The pass was strategically vital, controlling movement along the coast between Libya and Egypt, and Rommel wasn't about to let it stay in British hands. Less than 2 weeks later, he launched a swift counterattack, Operation Skorpion. On the 26th of May 1941, German forces under Colonel Maximilian von Herf led a combined Axis force to retake the pass. German units included motorized infantry and anti-tank detachments supported by Italian Bersaglieri troops and artillery. They struck with speed and coordination, overwhelming the British garrison before it could fully entrench. The defenders had little armor support and were low on heavy weapons. They fought hard but were quickly flanked and shelled. German 88mm guns, brought up with typical Rommel-style daring, neutralized British gun positions at close range. By the end of the day, the British were forced to abandon the pass. By the 27th of May, Axis forces had fully secured Halfa. Rommel wasted no time turning it into a fortress. Mines were laid, bunkers dug, anti-tank guns positioned. The site would soon become infamous as the Hellfire Pass, a killing ground for any future Allied assault. Operation Skorpion erased the only British gain from Operation Brevity and re-established Axis control of the frontier. With Halfa Pass now fortified, Rommel had a strong forward position, and the British had one more obstacle between them and Tobruk. The British would have to come at them harder. Operation Battleaxe, Axis victory, 15th of June 1941 to the 17th of June 1941. By June 1941, the British were under pressure from both Rommel in the desert and Churchill in London. Tobruk was still under siege. The Axis had fortified the border at Halfa Pass, and the British had failed to dislodge them during Operation Brevity. But the political clock was ticking. Churchill wanted action, something bold, something public. The result was Operation Battleaxe, the first major British attempt to break the siege of Tobruk and push Rommel back. The plan was ambitious. British forces would strike along the coastal road, recapture Halfa Pass and Fort Capuzzo, and advance west toward Tobruk. Inside the city, the garrison would prepare to break out and link up with the attacking force. The attacking force consisted of around 25,000 men, 90 tanks, and multiple artillery regiments, mainly from the 7th Armoured Division and the 4th Indian Division, commanded by General Noel Beresford-Perce. The Germans, meanwhile, had dug in at key terrain points, supported by 88mm anti-tank guns, mobile reserves, and a hardened forward screen of German and Italian infantry. Battleaxe began early on the 15th of June 1941. The British made initial gains, pushing into Fort Capuzzo and parts of Hafid Ridge, but problems emerged almost immediately. Rommel had anticipated the offensive. British tanks advanced without adequate infantry or artillery cover. German PaK-38 and 88mm guns destroyed dozens of British cruisers and Matilda tanks from long range. At Halfa Pass, the defenders were entrenched, well supplied, and prepared. Attacks failed to make meaningful progress. In the center, British formations were confused by terrain and poor coordination, and some units simply lost contact with each other. By the second day, German counterattacks began. Rommel launched swift armoured thrusts against overextended British units, forcing them back and reclaiming lost ground. By the 17th of June, the British were retreating. Rommel's forces pursued briefly, but eventually halted, content with the damage done. In 3 days, the British had lost scores of tanks and suffered over 1,000 casualties. German losses were lighter, around 600 men and 12 tanks, but the result was clear. Battleaxe had failed. Tobruk remained cut off. Churchill, frustrated by yet another failure, removed General Archibald Wavell as Commander-in-Chief, Middle East. He was replaced by General Claude Auchinleck. Battleaxe was a hard lesson. British armour doctrine was still flawed. The coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery was uneven at best. With summer setting in and both sides exhausted, the front quieted. But Tobruk still held, and behind the scenes, British planners began preparing something bigger. They would call it Operation Crusader. Operation Crusader, Allied victory, 18th of November 1941 to the 30th of December 1941. For 8 brutal months, Tobruk had held, but it was still cut off, and Rommel still held the initiative. By late 1941, the British knew they couldn't afford another failed offensive. Operation Crusader was their answer. Launched on the 18th of November 1941, Crusader was the first full-scale Allied offensive against the Afrika Korps since Rommel's arrival. It was also a gamble, a sprawling, high-risk plan involving over 100,000 troops, over 700 tanks, and coordination between multiple Commonwealth divisions. The aim was simple: destroy the Afrika Korps in the field, relieve Tobruk, and force the Axis back out of eastern Libya. This time, command had changed hands. General Claude Auchinleck had replaced Wavell as Commander-in-Chief Middle East. Operational control went to Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham, leading the newly formed 8th Army, a force comprised of British, Indian, South African, and New Zealand troops, backed by artillery and the RAF. Rommel's forces, though seasoned, were stretched. He had fewer tanks, roughly 270 operational at the start of the battle, and relied heavily on coordination with Italian divisions like Ariete and Trieste to hold the flanks. But as always, he had the edge in speed, deception, and tactical maneuver. Crusader began with a sweeping armoured hook. The plan called for the British 30th Corps, led by the 7th Armoured Division, to circle south and east, draw Axis Panzer divisions into open battle, and pin them down. Meanwhile, the 13th Corps would push through the frontier positions, Sollum, Halfa, Bardia, while a breakout force inside Tobruk would prepare to link up from the west. What followed was a month of fluid, chaotic, and often brutal fighting across the open desert. In the first week, British tank units made contact near Sidi Bou Zid. It was a slaughterhouse. Over 3 days, the 5th South African Brigade was mauled by German armour and artillery. British units lost coordination, and their tanks, still vulnerable to German 88mm guns, suffered heavy losses. Cunningham began to lose confidence in the offensive. Rommel, sensing weakness, took a bold risk. He pivoted east and launched a counteroffensive aimed at the Egyptian frontier, hoping to encircle British forces and collapse the offensive. He even bypassed the main British spearheads and briefly reached the rear areas near Sidi Omar, a classic Rommel move, but this time it didn't work. Auchinleck had removed Cunningham on the 25th of November, replacing him with Major General Neil Ritchie. Unlike earlier operations, the British refused to retreat. Their forces regrouped, absorbed the blow, and hit back. Crucially, Rommel's supply lines were overstretched, and Italian support units were failing to keep pace. Axis fuel shortages slowed their momentum at a critical moment. Inside Tobruk, the garrison, led by Australians and now reinforced by Polish and British units, launched its breakout on the 21st of November, striking west toward El Duda and Belhamed. After fierce fighting, they made contact with New Zealand forces on the 27th of November. Commonwealth forces finally linked up with the Tobruk garrison. The siege was over, but the wider battle still raged. Rommel launched repeated counterattacks in early December, trying to retake Sidi Bou Zid and cut off British gains. But British infantry held. RAF sorties hammered Axis columns. Slowly, the momentum shifted. The Germans were fighting hard but losing ground. By the 7th of December, Rommel began withdrawing westward. He didn't call it a retreat, he called it a mobile defense. But by the end of December, Axis forces had pulled out of Cyrenaica entirely, falling back to El Agheila. The cost had been staggering. British forces lost over 18,000 men and over 700 tanks in the fighting, more than in any prior desert battle. Axis losses were similar. Over 38,000 casualties, including Italians, and more than 300 tanks destroyed or abandoned. The Africa Corps had been bloodied. Their advance into Egypt was finished. Crusader didn't destroy Rommel, but it did what Battleaxe and Brevity couldn't. It broke the siege of Tobruk and reclaimed the initiative. For the first time in 1941, the British had delivered a clear, strategic victory in North Africa. It was also a test of endurance. Coordination across national forces, British armour, South African brigades, New Zealand infantry, Indian engineers, Polish artillery, had improved. The 8th Army had fought through chaos, setbacks, and command changes, and still forced Rommel back. But the Desert War wasn't over. Rommel had retreated, not surrendered. He was already preparing for a counterstroke. For now though, Tobruk was free, Cyrenaica was in Allied hands, and the 8th Army had proven it could beat the Desert Fox, if only just. Axis victory, 21st of January 1942 to the 4th of February 1942. Crusader had driven Rommel out of Cyrenaica, but the victory didn't last long. After the retreat to El Agheila in December 1941, the British believed the Africa Corps was finished, at least for the moment. Rommel's supply lines were overextended, his troops were exhausted, and the Italians in no shape to launch another offensive. British command shifted to holding and rebuilding, confident they could pause the campaign until spring. But Rommel had no intention of waiting. On the 21st of January 1942, with barely a month to recover from Crusader, he attacked. What followed became known as Rommel's January counteroffensive, a lightning campaign that caught the British completely off guard. With a fraction of his original strength, he launched a surprise assault east of El Agheila, deploying his remaining divisions, along with Italian units from Ariete and Trento. The British had assumed the Axis would stay on the defensive. Many frontline units were weakened from Crusader, Some were rotated out. Intelligence had underestimated German fuel stocks, believing Rommel couldn't sustain a rapid advance. They were wrong on every count. Rommel moved fast, bypassing British strongpoints and punching through the southern flank. The 7th Armoured Division, still recovering from its own losses, fell back. Rommel's tanks advanced more than 300 kilometers in 10 days, reoccupying key positions at Mers-el-Kebir and eventually Derna. By the end of January, the Germans had reached the outskirts of Benghazi. British command scrambled to stabilize the situation. General Ritchie, caught flat-footed, ordered a withdrawal eastward. Once again, British forces abandoned Cyrenaica under pressure. Territory they had fought bitterly to reclaim just weeks earlier. This time, the retreat was more orderly. Supply lines weren't overrun, rear guards brought in time, but the strategic picture was clear. The Allies had been outmaneuvered, and Rommel had regained the initiative. On the 4th of February 1942, Axis forces retook Benghazi without a fight. Rommel halted his advance shortly after. His forces, though victorious, were still running low on fuel and spare parts. The counteroffensive hadn't been planned as a full campaign. It was a calculated gamble. Seize the moment, strike before the British recovered, and reassert pressure in the desert. It worked. Once again, the lines of battle had shifted dramatically. Tobruk remained in Allied hands, but most of Cyrenaica was lost. Again. Rommel, with limited resources and impeccable timing, had pulled off another desert reversal. The Battle of Gazala, Axis victory, 26th of May 1942 to the 21st of June 1942. By May 1942, the front had stabilized, but only just. After Rommel's January counteroffensive, the Axis once again controlled most of Cyrenaica. The British held a new defensive line west of Tobruk, nearing a string of desert settlements collectively known as Gazala. Both sides paused to refit and reinforce, but it was clear that the next battle would be decisive. This time, the British weren't caught off guard. Under General Neil Ritchie, the 8th Army had fortified its positions. The British front ran from the coast near Gazala, south through Knightsbridge, and all the way into the open desert near Bir Hakeim, held by Free French forces. Between those strong points were miles of open sand laced with minefields and barbed wire. Behind the line, Ritchie positioned reserves to respond quickly to Axis attacks. Rommel faced a difficult choice: assault the British line head-on or go around it. He chose to go around. On the 26th of May 1942, the Battle of Gazala began. Rommel's plan, later nicknamed the Gazala Gallop, was bold. He sent his mobile units, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, the Ariete Armored Division, and infantry and trucks on a massive flanking move to the south. They curved around the British left, deep into the desert, bypassing minefields and outposts, aiming to strike the 8th Army from behind. It almost worked perfectly. By the 27th of May, Axis armor had pushed into the British rear, causing chaos. Supply depots were overrun, communications broke down, but the British fought back hard. Units like the 1st and 7th Armoured Divisions struck Rommel's columns as they swung north. What followed was 2 weeks of chaotic, shifting combat, a battle of tanks, dust, and desert confusion. At the center of it all was a patch of sand known as the Cauldron. Rommel's forces had advanced so far they were now surrounded, trapped inside a pocket between British strongpoints. But instead of retreating, Rommel dug in. He brought in anti-tank guns, resupplied through narrow desert corridors, and turned the Cauldron into a killing zone. British armor attacked again and again, and was cut down by 88mm guns firing at point-blank range. Each British thrust failed. Ritchie hesitated, and Rommel waited. Meanwhile, to the far south, the Free French at Bir Hakeim were under siege. Outnumbered 5-1, they held out for over 2 weeks, tying down Axis forces and becoming legends in Free French military history. Their resistance gave the 8th Army time, but not direction. By early June, British momentum had stalled. On June 13th, Rommel counterattacked. His armor punched through British lines at Knightsbridge, scattering Allied reserves and collapsing the southern flank. The day became known as Black Saturday in the 8th Army. The 8th Army was now retreating. Ritchie ordered a fallback toward the Egyptian border, leaving Tobruk exposed. Churchill, realizing what was coming, pleaded for reinforcements, but it was too late. On the 20th of June, Rommel struck. Tobruk, the fortress that had held for 241 days in 1941, now collapsed in 24 hours. Axis forces breached the perimeter with combined air and ground attacks, supported by Italian infantry and German panzers. The British garrison, over 30,000 men, surrendered en masse. It was the largest British capitulation of the war up to that point. Churchill called it a shattering blow. In Berlin, Hitler was so overjoyed that he made Rommel a field marshal on the spot. By the 21st of June, the Battle of Gazala was over. Rommel had captured over 35,000 prisoners, 2,000 vehicles, and massive fuel and supply dumps. The Axis controlled Tobruk, Cyrenaica, and the road to Egypt was wide open. British morale cratered. The 8th Army was in full retreat. In Cairo, officials began burning documents in fear of a German advance. Rommel had achieved what many thought impossible, a clean, crushing victory in the open desert. But even now, his fuel stocks were dangerously low and his supply line was stretched to the breaking point. Still, he pushed on. The fall of Tobruk, Axis victory, 20th of June 1942 to the 21st of June 1942. The fall of Tobruk in 1942 was one of the most shocking Allied defeats of the entire war. After the collapse of the Gazala line in mid-June, British forces retreated east toward Egypt, leaving Tobruk exposed and poorly defended. While it had withstood a siege for 241 days in 1941, this time it fell in just 24 hours. Rommel knew he had an opening and he took it. On the 20th of June 1942, the Afrika Korps launched a concentrated assault on the southeastern perimeter of the Tobruk defenses. The garrison, mostly British with some Indian and South African units, numbered over 35,000 men, but they were exhausted, undersupplied, and reeling from the rapid retreat after Gazala. Rommel's forces came in fast and heavy. German 88mm guns opened fire on the defensive belts, clearing the way for tanks and engineers. Luftwaffe dive bombers, Stukas, pounded strongpoints and gun pits. Then came the tanks. Panzers of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, supported by Italian infantry and artillery, punched through a weak sector southeast of the port. The defenses crumbled. British units tried to regroup, but coordination broke down almost immediately. Ammunition dumps were hit, lines of communication collapsed, and resistance fragmented. By midday, Axis armor had broken through the second defensive line and were advancing directly into the city. Supply dumps, barracks, and harbour facilities were taken one by one. Some British units attempted to fight on, but by the evening of the 21st of June, it was over. General Hendrik Klopper, commander of the Tobruk garrison, surrendered. Over 33,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner, making it the largest British capitulation since Singapore. Axis forces captured more than 2,000 vehicles, 5,000 tons of fuel, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The port facilities were largely intact, another major boost to Axis logistics. Rommel had seized not just the city, but a functioning supply base. Churchill was devastated. News of Tobruk's fall hit London like a thunderclap. He later wrote, "This was one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war." In Germany, the reaction was of course the opposite. Rommel's triumph was splashed across every newspaper. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal, declaring Tobruk a victory without parallel. But beneath the triumph, warning signs were emerging. Rommel's forces were now stretched thin. The rapid advance had burned through fuel and spare parts. Italian logistics couldn't keep up, and the British, though humiliated, still held the road to El Alamein, just 100 kilometers from Alexandria and the Nile Delta. Tobruk's fall marked the darkest hour of the Allied North African campaign. The Battle of Mersa Matruh, Axis victory, 26th of June 1942 to the 29th of June 1942. After the fall of Tobruk, the British 8th Army was in full retreat, and Rommel was right behind them. The next defensive stop was Matruh, a coastal fortress town roughly 200 kilometers west of El Alamein. It had bunkers, minefields, and supply depots, but it wasn't designed to stop a force moving as fast as the Afrika Korps. Rommel didn't pause. Fresh off the Tobruk victory, he pressed the attack, hoping to destroy British forces before they could regroup. By the 26th of June, German and Italian armor were engaging British rearguards around the town. Inside Matruh, the British were reorganizing. The command situation was confused. General Ritchie remained in charge, but communications were spotty and coordination between corps was breaking down. The 10th and 13th Corps, responsible for defending the area, were poorly synchronized, and Rommel exploited the gaps. On the 27th of June, Axis forces outflanked the British positions, coming in from the desert south of the town. German tanks slammed into the rear areas, cutting off escape routes and trapping several British brigades. Panic spread. Supplies were torched to avoid capture. Whole units withdrew without orders. By the morning of the 29th of June, British command ordered a general retreat. The fighting ended in chaos. Thousands of British and Commonwealth troops escaped through a narrow corridor to the east, but around 6,000 were captured along with guns, fuel, and vehicles. Rommel had won another victory, and the road to Egypt was wide open. But the retreat didn't break the 8th Army entirely. A new defensive line was forming at El Alamein, anchored on the Mediterranean coast and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south. It was the last natural choke point before the Nile Delta. The British still had one more line to hold, and now they had no choice. First Battle of El Alamein, inconclusive. 1st of July 1942 to the 27th of July 1942. By the end of June 1942, British morale in North Africa was on the brink. Rommel's Afrika Korps had advanced more than 600 kilometers in just 3 weeks and now stood within striking distance of Alexandria, the Suez Canal, and the heart of the British Empire in the Middle East. But there was one final natural barrier left: El Alamein. The terrain here gave the British their first real advantage in weeks. Just south of the coastal town was the Qattara Depression, a vast, impassable salt basin that stretched deep into the desert. Any advance had to come along a narrow front between the Mediterranean and the Depression. No wide flanking maneuvers, no sweeping Gazala gallop, just a tight, brutal fight. British command had changed again. General Claude Auchinleck, frustrated by General Ritchie's failures, had taken direct control of the 8th Army. He knew there was no more room to retreat. Either the Axis were stopped here, or Egypt would fall. Rommel, riding the high of successive victories, was confident. His forces were tired, low on fuel, and stretched thin, but he saw no reason to stop. On July 1st, he attacked. The battle opened with a German thrust at the Alamein Box, a fortified position held by the 1st South African Division. The defenders held firm. British artillery poured fire into the German columns, and anti-tank guns tore into Rommel's panzers. The advance stalled almost immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, Rommel tried again and again to break the line. At Ruwaysat Ridge, Tel El Aissa, and Bab el Qattara. Each time, he met fierce resistance. Auchinleck, unlike his predecessors, moved reserves quickly and counterattacked with precision. Indian, Australian, and New Zealand divisions fought hard across the line, repelling Axis assaults and launching raids into their flanks. The fighting was brutal. Sandstorms blinded gunners, heat broke engines, night attacks turned into bayonet brawls, and Rommel, for the first time, couldn't gain ground. By mid-July, Axis forces were exhausted. Their supply lines stretched all the way back to Tripoli. Italian units were breaking down and German units were running on fumes, and the British line held. On the 27th of July, Auchinleck ordered a general offensive to try push Rommel back. The results were mixed. Some gains were made, but no breakthrough. Still, it was enough to end Rommel's offensive for good. Rommel had reached his limit. He had lost the element of surprise, his troops were worn out, and the myth of his invincibility had cracked. For the British, this battle was the first time in months they'd stopped falling back. The line had held. Egypt had been saved, for now. But Auchinleck's cautious follow-up frustrated Churchill. The Prime Minister wanted not just a defence, but a knockout. Within weeks, Auchinleck would be replaced. The next phase of the Desert War would be led by Bernard Montgomery, and the battle for El Alamein over for now. The Battle of Alam Halfa, Allied victory, 30th of August 1942 to the 5th of September 1942. By late August 1942, Rommel knew he was running out of time. Supplies were tight, Axis forces were exhausted, and the British were getting stronger by the week. But he believed one final offensive could break the stalemate at El Alamein. If he could outflank the British lines, swing around the southern end of the Qattara Depression, and hit Alexandria, the Desert War could still be won. Rommel launched his assaults on the 30th of August, targeting the southern flank near Alam Halfa Ridge, a key high ground held by the newly appointed General Bernard Montgomery and his 8th Army. Montgomery had been in command for barely 2 weeks, but had already overhauled the defensive plan. He anticipated Rommel's flanking move and deliberately left the southern sector lightly screened, baiting the Afrika Korps into attacking where British defences were strongest, just behind the ridge. As Rommel's tanks advanced, they immediately ran into problems. Dust storms and night movement had slowed their progress. British minefields funneled Axis units into narrow corridors, and once they reached Alam Halfa, they were hit hard by British anti-tank guns, artillery, and the Royal Air Force, which had complete air superiority for the first time in the campaign. Rommel had pressed the attack for several days, but his tanks couldn't dislodge the defenders. Fuel shortages became critical. His supply lines were stretched too far, and Montgomery refused to be drawn into a mobile battle. He stayed dug in, absorbing the blows. By the 7th of September, Rommel called off the offensive and began pulling back. He'd lost over 2,500 men and dozens of tanks. British losses were light by comparison. Rommel had been stopped cold. The Afrika Korps was now spent, and Montgomery had bought time to prepare his counteroffensive. Operation Agreement, Axis victory, 13th of September 1942 to the 14th of September 1942. While the front lines were holding at El Alamein, the Allies launched a bold and ultimately doomed raid deep behind enemy lines. Operation Agreement. The target was Tobruk, now in Axis hands and serving as a major supply port for Rommel's forces. The plan was ambitious, a combined sea, land, and air assault to cripple the port's infrastructure, destroy supplies, and disrupt Axis logistics ahead of the next British offensive. On the 13th of September 1942, British commandos, Royal Marines, and elements of the Long-Range Desert Group launched a multi-pronged attack. The main force arrived by sea, landing near Tobruk under the cover of darkness, while smaller detachments struck from the desert and air. From the start, the operation went sideways. The naval approach was detected early. German and Italian coastal defences opened fire on the landing force before it even reached the shore. Several landing craft were destroyed and many troops never made it off the beach. Those who did were met with heavy resistance. Simultaneously, LRDG and SAS units attempting sabotage missions inland ran into stronger than expected Axis patrols. Communications broke down, air support arrived late and scattered. Over 2 days of fighting, the Allied raiders were surrounded, outgunned, and ultimately forced to surrender or withdraw. Over 700 British and Commonwealth troops were killed or captured, and multiple warships and landing craft were lost, including the destroyer HMS Sikh and the anti-aircraft ship HMS Zulu. For the Axis, it was a clear-cut victory. Tobruk's facilities were barely scratched, and the failed raid had cost the Allies dearly. Rommel even used the episode to reinforce his coastal defences, tightening security across the region. Operation Agreement was a bold idea, but poorly executed. It highlighted both the daring of British Special Forces and the high price of miscalculation in enemy territory. It also served as a distraction from what was really coming, because in just over a month, the main event would begin: the Second Battle of El Alamein. The Second Battle of El Alamein, Allied victory, 23rd of October 1942 to the 11th of November 1942. In the deserts of North Africa, the war was about to turn. By October 10th, 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps was spent, supplies were short, his troops were exhausted, and he was nowhere near full strength. Yet they held the line at El Alamein, dug in behind miles of mines, barbed wire, and interlocking defenses. Behind them lay Alexandria, the Suez Canal, and the Middle East. In front of them stood the newly reinforced British 8th Army, now under the command of General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery had spent months preparing. He built up a force of nearly 200,000 men, supported by 1,000 tanks, 900 artillery pieces, and over 500 aircraft. His plan was to grind Rommel down inch by inch until the Axis line broke. It would be the first time since the war began that the British would go on the offensive with numerical superiority, clear logistics, and total air dominance. The assault began on the 23rd of October 1942, just after 9:40 p.m. A massive artillery barrage, over 900 guns firing in unison, opened the battle. It was the largest British bombardment since the First World War. The ground shook as shells rained down on Axis positions, smashing bunkers, cutting wires, and disorienting defenders. Then came Operation Lightfoot. Infantry from the Commonwealth divisions, British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian, advanced across a narrow front in the north. Their job was to clear 2 lanes through the minefields, wide enough for the armoured divisions to pass through. Rommel was in Germany when the battle started, recovering from illness and pleading for reinforcements. He flew back to North Africa immediately, but by the time he arrived, Montgomery had already driven deep into the Axis defensive belts. But progress was slow. The minefields were deep and dense. Axis defenders, especially the Italian Folgore and Pavia divisions, fought with surprising resilience. German 88mm guns continued to chew through British armour. By the 27th of October, the offensive bogged down. Some British units had taken heavy casualties. The Germans launched counterattacks at Kidney Ridge and Tel El Akakir, hoping to stall the advance. For a few days, it seemed like another stalemate was setting in, but Montgomery wasn't finished. He shifted focus to the north and prepared Operation Supercharge, a second, harder push to break the Axis line for good. On the 2nd of November, after another thunderous artillery barrage, New Zealand infantry and British armoured divisions attacked the German positions at Tel El Akakir. This time, they broke through. Rommel, now fully back in command, knew the situation was collapsing. He requested permission from Hitler to retreat, but Hitler replied with a single word: stand fast. No withdrawal, no surrender. Fight to the last man. Rommel ignored him. By the 4th of November, Axis lines were disintegrating. Italian units were overwhelmed, German formations were retreating in disarray, hundreds of tanks and vehicles were abandoned. The Afrika Korps, once feared across the desert, was now on the run. Montgomery didn't let up. By the 5th of November, British forces were pouring west. Tobruk, Benghazi, and Tripoli lay ahead. The desert that had once been a battlefield was now a highway. Rommel escaped with the remnants of his army, what he called a broken shell of a force. The retreat would stretch across hundreds of miles through the Libyan desert toward Tunisia. Back in London, Churchill stood in the House of Commons and declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The victory came at a cost though. The 8th Army suffered over 13,500 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Axis losses were greater. Over 30,000 men captured, along with 500 tanks and 1,000 guns destroyed or abandoned. Italian divisions, outgunned and undersupplied, had borne the brunts of the collapse. But the outcome was undeniable. El Alamein was the turning point of the war in North Africa. It shattered the myth of Axis invincibility. It reversed the tide of retreat that had haunted the British since 1940, and it proved, finally, that Rommel could be beaten. More importantly, it opened the way for a new front, because just days after El Alamein, American and British forces would land in French North Africa as part of Operation Torch. Rommel's days in Africa were numbered, but for the men who fought in the sand and heat at El Alamein, those who endured minefields, artillery barrages, and the roar of engines in the dark, victory was hard-earned and long overdue. Operation Torch, Allied victory, 8th of November 1942 to the 16th of November 1942. Just days after Montgomery's victory at El Alamein, another Allied army came ashore, this time from the west. Operation Torch was the first major American-led operation of the war. It marked the opening of a second front in North Africa and a dramatic escalation in the global fight against the Axis. While the British 8th Army was chasing Rommel out of Libya, American and British forces were landing in French North Africa, aiming to trap the Axis in a pincer between Tunisia and Egypt. But the operation wasn't just military, it was also political. The French colonies in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia were under the control of Vichy France, officially neutral but collaborating with Nazi Germany. Torch's success depended on landing large Allied forces along the North African coast without triggering full-scale French resistance. On the 8th of November 1942, Allied troops came ashore in 3 major landing zones. The Western Task Force, mostly American, landed near Casablanca in Morocco. The Central Task Force hit the beaches near Oran in western Algeria. And the Eastern Task Force, largely British with some Americans, landed near Algiers. In total, over 100,000 Allied troops took part in the landings, backed by over 500 ships and hundreds of aircraft. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that point. Reactions from the French varied. Some garrisons resisted, especially around Casablanca and Oran, where fighting was fierce for 2 days. But in many areas, French officers hesitated, unwilling to spill blood for a Vichy regime they didn't fully support. In Algiers, a local anti-Vichy coup by French resistance fighters helped the Allies secure the city with minimal fighting. By the 10th of November, the French in Algiers and Oran had ceased resistance. On the 11th of November, the German Wehrmacht responded by occupying all of Vichy France, ending even the illusion of neutrality. That same day, Admiral François Darlan, Vichy's military commander in North Africa, agreed to a ceasefire with the Allies, effectively switching sides. In just over a week, the Allies had seized most of French North Africa. German and Italian forces rushed reinforcements into Tunisia, trying to establish a defensive line before the Allies could advance. Rommel, now retreating from El Alamein, knew the trap was closing. Operation Torch meant fighting a 2-front war in North Africa for the Axis, while for the Allies, it meant the Americans were fully committed to the European theatre and working in coordination with the British at scale. It also put pressure on Germany to divert resources away from the Eastern Front to support a crumbling position in the Mediterranean. The final chapter of the Desert War had begun. The run for Tunis. Axis victory. 10th of November 1942 to the 25th of December 1942. After the Torch landings, Allied forces surged eastward, aiming to seize Tunis before Axis reinforcements could arrive. It looked doable. German forces in Tunisia were minimal and the element of surprise was on the Allies' side. But the terrain, weather, and logistics said otherwise. British and American troops moved out from Algeria in mid-November, crossing the mountains into Tunisia. But the advance was slow. Rain turned roads to mud, supplies lagged far behind. The Americans, still largely an inexperienced force, struggled with coordination and unfamiliar ground. Meanwhile, the Germans moved faster. Troops, tanks, and artillery began arriving by air and sea just days after Torch. The Luftwaffe quickly established air superiority over Tunisia, bombing Allied supply columns and choking off their advance. By November, the Allies had reached within sight of Tunis, but they were too late. Axis defenses were already forming. German armor, now under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, struck back in sharp counterattacks, driving Allied forces back into the hills. By mid-December, it was over. The Allies paused. Tunis remained in Axis hands, and the race had been lost. The Battle of Sidi Bou Zid. Axis victory, 14th of February 1943 to the 17th of February 1943. 2 weeks after Faid Pass, Rommel struck again, this time harder. The Americans had repositioned around Sidi Bou Zid, a cluster of hilltop outposts in central Tunisia. Spread out across open ground and anchored by infantry dug into isolated high points, the defense looked solid on a map, but to Rommel, it was a gift. On the 14th of February, the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions launched a coordinated assault. Axis tanks struck from multiple directions, first cutting between the American strongpoints, then encircling them. Artillery pinned the defenders. Dust and confusion did the rest. American command faltered. Units couldn't support one another. Tank reserves were held back or misdirected. Radio communication broke down across the sector. Infantry on the hills were cut off. Some fought until overrun, others were captured or forced to retreat on foot. By the 16th of February, most of the American positions had collapsed. A counterattack by US armor on the 17th failed to retake ground. The battlefield was littered with wrecked tanks and scorched equipment. Rommel had chewed through another piece of the Allied line, over 2,500 US casualties and hundreds of vehicles lost. Sidi Bou Zid exposed deep flaws, rigid command, poor coordination, and an underestimation of the enemy. The Americans were learning fast, but not fast enough. By early May, both flanks were collapsing. German forces were retreating into urban pockets, Italian units were surrendering en masse. On the 6th of May, troops of the 4th Indian Division and 7th Armored Division entered Tunis. The following day, American forces under General Terry Allen captured Bizerte. The war in North Africa was all but over. The Battle of Faid Pass, Axis victory, 30th of January 1943 to the 2nd of February 1943. In late January 1943, the US Army faced its first real test against German armor, and it wasn't even on the front line when the shooting started. At Faid Pass, key gap through Tunisia's eastern dorsal mountains, the initial defense was held by the French 19th Corps. American units were positioned on the high ground west of the pass. They were green, thinly spread and operating with vague, fragmented orders. On the 30th of January, the Germans launched the attack. The 21st Panzer Division, backed by artillery and Stuka dive bombers, smashed into the French positions and broke through fast. As the line collapsed, US forces were pulled in to shore up the defense. American artillery opened fire and armor moved up to the ridgelines. But it was too late. Communications failed, reinforcements arrived out of sync, and infantry units were flanked, cut off, and in some cases, overrun entirely. By the 2nd of February, the Axis held Faid Pass. US losses were sharp, over 700 casualties and dozens of vehicles lost. The Germans barely broke stride. Faid Pass exposed deep flaws in American command and battlefield coordination. It was a short battle, but it became clear. The US Army wasn't ready for the desert. At least, not yet. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, Axis victory, 19th of February 1943 to the 24th of February 1943. By mid-February 1943, Rommel saw a rare opportunity. The Americans had just been knocked off balance at Sidi Bou Zid. They were spread across central Tunisia in a line that was long, brittle, and underdefended. In front of them stood Kasserine Pass, a narrow, winding gap through the Atlas Mountains. On paper, it was a defensive choke point. In reality, it was wide open. Rommel's objective was simple: punch through Kasserine, spill into the rear of Allied positions, and seize Tebessa, a vital supply hub to the west. He believed a quick blow might collapse the American front and knock the Allies off balance long enough to restabilize the Axis position in Tunisia. His timing was perfect. The US 2nd Corps under General Lloyd Fredendall had no coherent front. Units were scattered in hilltop outposts, communications were a mess, and the high command was dug in miles behind the lines, in a literal cave, disconnected from the battlefield. Even the British, who were working alongside them, expressed concern. One liaison officer called Fredendall's setup a tragedy in the making. On February 19th, Rommel moved. Two battle groups, the 21st Panzer Division and 10th Panzer Division, attacked the American lines in force. The assault began in the south at Feriana and Speitler, then swung north toward the mouth of the Kasserine Pass. American troops, many facing their first real combat, were hit hard. Tank destroyers were poorly placed, infantry units lacked support. Some troops held, others broke and ran. German tanks rolled through the gaps in the line almost unopposed. By the morning of the 20th of February, the Axis had pushed deep into the pass. American artillery tried to slow them down. Engineers blew bridges and laid mines, but it wasn't enough. The German advance rolled forward, supported by Stuka dive bombers. US forces fell back to secondary positions near Thala and Jebel el Hamra. The British, seeing the collapse unfold, rushed reinforcements into the area, including elements of the 6th Armored Division and experienced artillery crews who knew how to fight in close terrain. By the 21st of February, Rommel's forces had broken through the pass, but now the situation changed. The further the Germans pushed, the thinner they got. Their supply lines were already stretched, fuel shortages slowed the advance, and the terrain made it difficult to maneuver. British artillery set up blocking positions west of the pass, hammering Axis spearheads trying to break through. Commanders on the ground like Colonel Paul Robinet and General Lucien Truscott took charge where higher command had failed. They organized defenses, coordinated with the British, and held their ground. By the 23rd of February, the momentum had shifted. Rommel was facing stiff resistance for the first time in days, and critically, he wasn't getting the support he'd expected from the Northern Axis forces under Arnim. The grand pincer movement Rommel envisioned never materialized. On the 24th of February, he ordered a withdrawal. The pass was abandoned. The offensive was over. Kasserine Pass was an Axis tactical victory, but a short-lived one. Rommel had smashed through the American line, inflicted over 10,000 Allied casualties, and destroyed or captured hundreds of vehicles and guns. But he hadn't broken the Allied campaign. He hadn't reached Tabessa. And now, his own forces were overstretched, exposed, and facing a growing Allied force that was beginning to adapt. The American performance at Kasserine was a disaster. General Eisenhower, the overall Allied commander, fired Fredendall and replaced him with George S. Patton, a hard-driving, no-nonsense officer who demanded discipline, speed, and aggression. The chain of command was overhauled. Training was intensified, British liaison improved, and perhaps most importantly, American units finally began learning how to fight as a modern combined arms army. Operation Ochsenkopf, Allied victory, 26th of February 1943 to the 4th of March 1943. Even after Kasserine, Rommel wasn't finished. In late February 1943, with pressure building from both east and west, the Germans launched Operation Ochsenkopf, Oxhead. It was a bold, two-pronged offensive aimed at the northern flank of the British First Army near Beja and Medjez el-Bab, in Tunisia's mountainous north. Rommel himself wasn't in charge of this one. He was focused on the Axis southern front, trying to hold off Montgomery's 8th Army. Command for Ochsenkopf fell to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who saw a chance to roll up the Allied northern line, seize supply centers, and destabilize the whole front before the British and Americans could fully consolidate after Kasserine. The attack began on the 26th of February. German and Italian units advanced, hitting Allied positions in the Oued-Zarga Valley and pushing toward Beja, a critical Allied supply base. Their main effort came through a narrow corridor of wooded hills, the so-called mousetrap, where terrain funneled units into choke points ideal for ambush. At first, the offensive made gains. British outposts were overrun and units from the Grenadier Guards were forced to pull back. The fighting was fierce and close range. Machine guns, mortars, and even hand-to-hand skirmishes in olive groves and dry riverbeds. But the advance began to break down almost as soon as it started. The British had air superiority. RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires strafed German columns and pounded supply convoys. Mud slowed German vehicles. Anti-tank defenses stiffened, and most importantly, the Allies, now fully alert to Axis tactics, held their lines effectively. By the 4th of March, the offensive stalled. The British had held at Beja, Sejanane, and Hunt's Gap. German casualties were mounting, tanks were bogged down or destroyed, and no breakthrough had materialized. Von Arnim called off the attack. Operation Ochsenkopf was Rommel's last real swing in North Africa, and it failed to regain the initiative. From this point forward, the Axis would only be retreating. The Battle of Medellin, Allied victory, 6th of March 1943. For Rommel, the end was near, and he knew it. After the failure at Kasserine and the stalling of Operation Ochsenkopf, the Axis position in North Africa was rapidly collapsing. The British 8th Army under Montgomery was pressing west from Libya, approaching the Mareth line and threatening to punch through into southern Tunisia. Rommel's last chance to slow them down came at the desert town of Medellin. On the 6th of March 1943, he launched a surprise attack, a concentrated strike with elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, supported by Italian armor and infantry. The goal was to hit the British line in the flank, disrupt their preparations, and maybe buy time to reinforce the Mareth line before Montgomery's full assault began. It didn't work. Montgomery's forces had intercepted Axis radio traffic days earlier and were ready. British anti-tank units had dug in across the hills and wadis surrounding the Medellin, supported by mobile artillery and strong RAF presence overhead. As soon as the Axis columns advanced, they were hit by a withering fire. British 6-pounder and 17-pounder anti-tank guns knocked out wave after wave of German and Italian tanks. RAF fighter bombers roared in low to finish the job. The battle was flat, open and exposed, perfect for defenders and deadly for attackers. By midday, the attack had completely failed. Rommel had lost over 50 tanks and more than 400 men in just a few hours. The British, by contrast, suffered only light casualties. It was the last offensive Rommel would ever command in Africa. 3 days later, he left Tunisia and returned to Germany on Hitler's orders, officially to recover from illness, unofficially because Berlin was preparing to abandon North Africa altogether. The Desert Fox was gone, and now the Allies would go on the attack against an overstretched, undermanned, and leaderless Axis force that had nowhere left to run. Battle of the Mareth Line, Allied victory, 19th of March 1943 to the 27th of March 1943. The British had crossed into Tunisia, and now they were staring down the last real Axis fortress in the south, the Mareth Line. Originally built by the French in the 1930s to defend Tunisia from an Italian invasion out of Libya, the Mareth Line was a series of fortified bunkers, trenches, minefields, and anti-tank ditches stretching from the Mediterranean coast inland to the edge of the Matmata Hills. Now, it was being used in reverse, manned by Italian First Army troops, reinforced with Germans left behind after Rommel's departure. Montgomery's 8th Army was on the move. After brushing aside Rommel's last failed attack at Medellin, they advanced northwest, pushing into position by mid-March. Montgomery's plan was two-pronged, a frontal assault on the coastal end of the line combined with a wide flanking maneuver through the rough terrain to the south. The main attack began on the night of the 20th of March. British infantry and armor moved up under artillery cover, hitting Axis defenses head-on near Wadi Zigzao. It was a bloody fight. Mud, mines, and rain slowed the tanks. Italian and German machine guns and artillery turned the Wadi into a killing zone. Progress was minimal and casualties mounted quickly. But the real breakthrough came from the flank. A few days later, New Zealand and Free French forces, supported by British armor, executed a long, difficult outflanking movement through the desert hills southwest of the line. Despite stiff resistance and harsh terrain, they managed to cross the enemy's rear at Wadi Akarit, threatening the Axis with encirclement. Facing collapse, the Axis began to withdraw north toward El Hama and eventually Gabes. By the 27th of March, the Mareth Line had fallen. The Axis abandoned their strongest defensive position in Tunisia. The British rolled forward, linking up with US forces coming in from the west. For Montgomery, it was a psychological victory as much as a tactical one, a final dismantling of the fortifications Rommel had counted on. For the Axis, it marked the beginning of a general retreat that would only end at the sea. The Battle of El Guitar, inconclusive, 23rd of March 1943 to the 3rd of April 1943. After the debacle at Kasserine, the US Army had a point to prove. Under General George S. Patton, the Second Corps had been rebuilt, retrained, and was about to face its first major test. At El Guitar, a strategic valley in central Tunisia guarding the road to Garbes. On the 23rd of March, the Germans struck. Elements of the 10th Panzer Division launched a surprise attack down the valley, aiming to roll over American positions. But this time, US forces were dug in, artillery set, tank destroyers hidden, and infantry holding high ground. The result was a complete stomp. American gunners destroyed over 30 German tanks in the first few hours. The German assault failed to break through, and follow-up attacks were repulsed with heavy losses. Patton ordered counterattacks into the surrounding hills, but the terrain was brutal, and German paratroopers held firm. Progress stalled. After days of fighting, neither side had scored a decisive win. Still, the psychological shift was real. The Americans had taken a punch and given one back. El Ghouta proved they were no longer green, and with the British pushing from the east, the Axis in Tunisia were running out of space to fall back. The Battle of Wadi Akarit, Allied victory, 6th of April 1943 to the 7th of April 1943. After breaking through the Mareth line in late March, Montgomery's 8th Army advanced quickly up the Tunisian coast. The Axis, retreating in disorder, dug in at Wadi Akarit, a natural defensive line north of Garbes where a steep escarpment and the sea formed a narrow choke point. It was their last real defensive position in southern Tunisia. On the 6th of April 1943, Montgomery struck. The attack was well prepared. British infantry, including the 51st Highland Division and 4th Indian Division, advanced across the wadi under artillery cover. The terrain was narrow and exposed, but the assault was relentless. German and Italian forces, including remnants of the Italian First Army, fought hard using well-dug positions and supporting fire from the high ground. But the Allies had momentum, coordination, and firepower on their side. A flanking movement by New Zealand troops cracked open the northern end of the Axis line. By the next day, the position was collapsing. The Axis began retreating toward Enfiraville further north. The British pushed forward, seizing key ground and cutting off rearguard units. Wadi Akarit was a clean Allied win, and by this point, the pattern was clear. Each Axis fallback was quicker, less organized, and more desperate than the last. The walls were closing in. The Battle of Fonduk Pass, Allied victory, 8th of April 1943 to the 10th of April 1943. As the Axis retreated into northern Tunisia, the Allies raced to cut off their escape. One of the key choke points was Fonduk Pass, a narrow mountain corridor leading toward Kairouan and the coast beyond. On the 8th of April 1943, American forces of the 34th Infantry Division, supported by armor, launched a direct assault on the pass. Their objective was to punch through and block the Axis retreat routes. But the terrain was rough, and the defenders' German and Italian units from Arnim's 5th Panzer Army were well positioned. The attack stalled almost immediately. American armor was funneled into narrow wadis and exposed to anti-tank fire. Coordination between infantry and tanks broke down. Requests for British armored support were delayed. When British units from the 9th Corps did arrive, the two sides clashed, literally, over command, objectives, and radio frequencies. After 3 days of fighting, the Allies finally broke through the pass, but the Axis troops had already withdrawn. Fonduk was technically a victory, but it was messy. The Germans got away, and more importantly, Allied leaders, especially British General Brian Horrocks and American General Ernest Harmon, left the field frustrated by the lack of cohesion. The Battle of Hill 609, Allied victory, 27th of April 1943 to the 1st of May 1943. By late April 1943, the Axis front in Tunisia was shrinking fast. One of the toughest remaining positions lay in front of the US 2nd Corps, now under the aggressive and fast-rising General Omar Bradley. The obstacle was Hill 609, a steep, rocky height east of Sejanan, dominating the terrain for miles. German artillery observers on the summit could direct fire onto every road, wadi, and ridge in the area. Any Allied movement toward the northeast corner of the Axis line had to go through it, or around it, under fire. The Germans, mostly from the elite 334th Infantry Division, had fortified it with trenches, mortars, and interlocking machine guns. On the 27th of April, he ordered the 34th Infantry Division, led by General Charles Ryder, to take the hill directly. It was one of the toughest orders US forces had received in Tunisia, a frontal assault against a dug-in, experienced enemy on commanding terrain. The first attacks were repulsed. American infantry had to cross open ground, climb exposed slopes, and assault fixed positions under constant shellfire. Progress was measured in yards. German machine guns swept every approach, but US artillery worked overtime, pounding the summit day and night. Slowly, methodically, the lines inched forward. By the 30th of April, the Americans were nearing the top. Bayonet charges and close quarters fighting cleared one ridge after another. Units from the 168th Infantry Regiment finally seized the summit on the 1st of May. German counterattacks were driven off, and Hill 609 was in American hands. The decisive capture of Hill 609 cracked open the German flank and gave the US Army a commanding view of the final Axis positions near Matruh and Bizerte. It also sent a clear message to the Germans, to the British, and to the Americans themselves. The US Army had learned how to fight. It was one of the last major battles of the Tunisia campaign, and it was won the hard way. Operation Vulcan, Allied victory, 22nd of April 1943 to the 6th of May 1943. By late April 1943, Axis forces, cut off from reinforcements, low on fuel, and squeezed between two Allied armies, were cornered in a shrinking pocket around Tunis and Bizerte. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops remained, still entrenched, still fighting, but there was nowhere left to run. To finish the campaign, the Allies launched Operation Vulcan. This was the final, all-out offensive to capture Tunisia's last major cities and force an unconditional Axis surrender. The operation was spearheaded by the British First Army, supported by the US Second Corps and French 19th Corps, a multinational force of British, American, French, and colonial troops, all converging on one goal: break the final line and take the coast. The attack began on the 22nd of April. The initial push was concentrated south of Tunis, where British forces battered their way through entrenched German and Italian positions. The terrain was difficult: rugged hills, ridges, and olive groves laced with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Progress was slow, especially in the opening days. The Axis clung to strongpoints like the Jebel Bu Aukaz and Longstop Hill, launching local counterattacks to stall the Allied advance. But the balance of power was no longer even close. Allied artillery and air power hammered Axis lines day and night. RAF fighter bombers swept the skies. The US Second Corps, pushing north toward Bizerte, began rolling through increasingly disorganized opposition. Final Axis surrender. Allied victory. 13th of May, 1943. On the 13th of May, 1943, after nearly 3 years of shifting desert lines, sieges, raids, and full-scale battles, the entire Axis force in Tunisia collapsed. The final blow came just days after the fall of Tunis and Bizerte. German and Italian units, broken and encircled, simply gave up. Many surrendered in place. Others were rounded up as they tried to flee through mountain passes or hide among civilians. Over 275,000 Axis troops laid down their arms, more than the number captured at Stalingrad. Thousands of trucks, tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces were seized intact. What was left of the Afrika Korps was gone. Hitler had once called it the anvil on which the British Empire would break. Instead, it was crushed and swept off the map. In the final hours, German command tried to preserve dignity. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, now leading the shattered remnants of the Axis forces in Tunisia, was captured on the 12th of May while attempting to slip away in civilian clothes. Afterward, an unconditional surrender was declared. The Allies had achieved what seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Tunisia was in Allied hands. The entire Axis presence in Africa had been erased. Rommel's old dream of pushing into Egypt and linking up with forces from the Caucasus was dead. Mussolini's North African Empire was finished. North Africa had been a proving ground for the Allies. The British had gone from desperate retreats to disciplined, large-scale offensives. The Americans had entered the campaign raw and uncertain, but by the end, They were holding their own, leading attacks, and earning battlefield respect. The Free French had returned to the field with their flag flying. Indian, South African, New Zealand, Australian, Polish, Greek, and colonial units had all played their part. This was the first major theatre of the war the Allies had won together. It had cost them tens of thousands of lives, months of grinding desert combat, and bitter lessons in command and coordination, but it had also delivered something else: momentum. The Axis had lost their hold on Africa. Hitler's southern flank was exposed. From here, the Allies would cross the Mediterranean to Sicily, then Italy, and eventually into Nazi-occupied Europe itself. But that road began here, in the desert, across North Africa, in places like El Alamein, Beda, Fomm, Kasserine, Medellin, Hill 609. I hope you guys enjoyed that comprehensive look at the North African theatre in World War II. Let us know which of these battles is most interesting to you, and if we missed any interesting details in any of them. Let us know all this in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Huge thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Play War Thunder for free using the links in the description or pinned comment. New players and those returning after 6 months get a massive bonus pack with multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 silver lions, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator, and 7 days of premium access. This bonus pack is available only to those playing on PC and consoles. Hurry, as this offer is only around for a limited time.